So I'm Kyle Schweizer from the University of Missouri, and we're joined with Andrew Oppy. And we appreciate you being here all the way from Melbourne. And we're going to talk about the paper you had published in 2017 in JOT, which was functional outcomes post lisfranc injury, looking at transarticular screws, dorsal bridge plating, and a combination of the two. So what exactly prompted you to conduct this study?
Oh, thanks very much for having me, Kyle. So basically, I think there'd been a huge trend at that time, and still is, towards moving away from transarticular screw fixation and moving to even the new locking plates for fixation of lisfranc injuries. And really, there'd been a few small number of papers looking at this, but when you looked into the detail of the papers, they actually weren't the new modern locking plates as well. And with the theory of transarticular screws, sometimes anyway, being also more of a closed reduction rather than an open reduction. So we wanted to look at the reduction sort of comparison between the plate fixation and screw fixation. But also more importantly to us, we've had a big push around the world, obviously, but particularly also here in Australia on functional outcomes and how they relate to what we're doing. So we wanted to look at the functional outcomes related, comparing plates essentially to screws. But then when looking at our groups in our cohort, we clearly had a small number that were actually having partial plates, partial screws. So that's why we made that combination treatment option as well.
And what was your working hypothesis going into the paper?
Oh, look, personal bias is that I love to plate these fractures. So the working hypothesis was that bridging with locking plates was going to provide better functional outcome, and that was what we thought this paper was going to show. And which the beauty of doing research and good research is that it actually showed that that wasn't the case, and that the outcomes were very similar.
Yeah, I'm a big bridge plater too. I think that's a lot of people are trending away from screws just to avoid violating the joint. And so, like you said, the outcomes of the paper show that they were pretty similar. So you think that that's the most important aspect of the paper, or what do you think the main takeaway of the paper is?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, what we found quite clearly was that the fixation was not the main takeaway point of the paper, even though that was our primary hypothesis. So the main takeaway was, as we sort of known, but reaffirmed, is that reduction is the key. So, but it's interesting talking about, as you said, about the transarticular screws. There's been some good papers showing, sort of the percentage, how it affects about 6 to 7% of the articular surface putting a screw across. But, when you look at those cadaver studies, and they've done, that were great, but that's also on one screw pass. And I talked to my registrars and training surgeons about, well, how often are they putting multiple wires to make sure it's in the right position before they're putting the one screw across it as well? So that's also causing potentially more damage. So look, I think the main thing was to look at was, in the end, as finding of our paper. I mean, what we had 50 patients in our cohort in the end, and was to find that actually, the reduction is the key. But interestingly enough, with my paper, and unbeknownst to me at the time, but my very good colleague, Havinder Bedi, who works actually in private rooms with me, he works at our other major trauma centre in Melbourne, the Alfred Hospital. He was doing the same paper as me, which we didn't know. And he has that published subsequently in JBJS, or Bone of Journal Jote. And he had 100 patients in his cohort with the identical findings to ours. So what we've actually done now, because that's obviously was 4 years ago, I think his was about 3 years ago. Since then, we've combined our data and our research. So we've actually, I've always been part of the Victorian Orthopaedic Trauma Outcome Registry, which we've put together, which follows up outcomes for all of our orthopaedic trauma patients over Victoria, over 4 of our major hospitals. And it's been going now for 8 or 9 years. So we've got a lot of data in that. And we've now just recently received ethics approval, and we've started looking at our cohort. So we've got now over 780 patients who have had lisfranc injuries that have been fixed, and we've got functional outcome data for that. And we're going back now to review, like, the breaking it down to the mechanism of injury, was it high or low energy mechanisms, and then the fracture classification. Because I find with all trauma, because I do a lot of trauma all over the body, but it's so hard to differentiate between, for example, a lisfranc, that subtle, ligamentous injury, compared to a massive fracture dislocation, for example. And where are we comparing apples with apples? So we're breaking up our 780 patients at the moment to work out what those injuries were, how they were then treated, and then what their functional outcomes was. And the best thing about this paper is we're also going to get to sort of nearly 10-year data on them, which I think is really important, because one of the weaknesses of our paper was also the fact that the data kind of follow-up was not for an extended period of time. And we know that these potentially are going to develop post-traumatic arthritis more in the sort of medium to long-term future. And that's the cohort that we're looking at reviewing and focusing on in this new group.
That's great. Yeah, you had a couple things we could touch on there. You had mentioned the studies where the percentage of the joint, but then you also have toggle with weight bearing. So they tend to toggle and increase by about 10%. And then it's also traumatized joints too. So they have a fracture. So it's not a pristine cadaver. So it's actually probably more of the joint that's intact that's being damaged by the screw. So you would think that you would find something different. And maybe the problem is that, like, at least the difficulty that I have with when I read and try and interpret lisfranc literature is that you're right, it's not apples to apples. The range of midfoot injury that can occur, the level of fracture, which joint is more comminuted, how much displacement there is, what other associated injuries there are. Like, there's just so much variability, with a lisfranc injury, that it can make it really hard to study. It can make it hard to compare, and it's people talk about the gold standard is always prospective randomization, but it can be hard to randomize lisfrancs to treatment. And so what is something that you guys are trying to do in your study to maybe, I don't know, like in the study coming up, since we're talking about it, to kind of mitigate some of those issues that you have with the range and the spectrum of lisfranc injuries?
Look, unfortunately, as you know, it's really, really hard, as you've mentioned, but we're trying really hard to go through, and it's why it will take some time. We've got quite a good team on it, though, to go through the original X-rays. So, we've got the data. We've got all the outcome data in our database. So that's the Victorian Orthopaedic Trauma Outcome Registry keeps all of the all the data, SF36As, EQ5As, and so we've got to do the foot and ankle scores. So we've got to do that individually, but we've got to go back and look at those case notes and the histories and the X-rays, and then define them into those cohorts to try to break them up into those subgroups for analysis. So hopefully we can get some more information. And the beauty of our registry, and therefore our cohort, is that we have 2 major trauma centres involved, and we've got 2 metropolitan hospitals involved. So hopefully we're really looking at getting some of those sort of lower energy sporting type injuries as well as the high energy injuries, so we can look at all of them and then separate them for separate analysis as well. So, because as you're right, it's a huge issue, and we really need to, and the variation in treatment, even, I've done, 3 of them this week fixed, and the one I did on Monday was a very complex injury, soft tissue injury as well. I've only had to X-fix out the lateral column because it's not safe to fix from a soft tissue perspective, reduced, the TMT joint temporarily with a KY. So, I'll go back and definitively fix it at some stage, but the X-fix down the lateral column might be definitive. Well, that would skew our results in this sort of injury. So we've got to be able to exclude those sort of cases to try to get an appropriate cohort.
With the study that we're talking about, has there been anything in your practice that has evolved or changed since this paper was published? Like, do you do anything differently that you didn't do at the time?
So again, even when we went back through the data, even our cohort, there was some cases that were using non-locking plates. So, but we've been using locking plates since, because there's always that theory that when you put a plate on with non-locking screws, that it might actually move your reduction because it's trying to mold to the plate, and the plate may not be appropriate molded to that anatomy of the foot. So I think the difference is that we try to get the joints perfectly reduced and held, and then put a bridging plate on and actually use the locking screws, because the idea is to hold it in position rather than sort of use it to reduce it. So that's probably one thing I've taken forward from it, but not really, because I always was plating. And I think the only downside really to the plating, or one of the major ones, is obviously the cost difference, which is a big issue compared to a single screw going across the joint. A plate and screws are going to be a lot more expensive, but I'm very confident that again, still that I think our outcomes are going to be better using the plates because of all those issues that you and I have discussed today. That I'm sticking with the plates for the time being until we've completed this more recent updated score. Because I also think, as I discussed earlier, the screws get a bit of a bad name because a lot of people do use them in a closed reduction percutaneous technique. And I think that then eliminates that sort of visual open reduction, which we think is the most important thing, having the joint perfectly reduced. So how do you know that keystone is locked in and there's no little bit of debris blocking your reduction if you're doing it under II guidance? I just don't think that's perfect in my personal view.
No, I completely agree. And then, some of the some of the older studies in the fixed versus fused studies that, they talked about secondary surgery rates, and, screw removal was pretty common at the time. And I don't typically take my plates out when I bridge plate. And that's all I usually do is bridge plate as well. I don't know if you traditionally take yours out, but I only take them out if they're having pain or if I do have to end up converting them to a fusion for some reason, which is pretty rare.
Yeah, I think that's a really difficult decision and it's a case by case basis. I have to admit, I generally remove them, but that's not on everyone. So I review them clinically and see how they're progressing. I do find most patients, obviously, who are having any sort of problems improve by having them removed. But there is definitely a group that are happy to leave them in and they're functioning well, and I'll leave them in for sure. I understand actually the COTS group was looking at this when I was over there a couple of years ago when I was allowed to travel pre-COVID. They were putting together a review and a randomized controlled trial, I think it was, on the removal of lisfranc metalware. So I was looking forward to that outcome to see if that would sort of change my view on my attitude towards that.
On the study we're discussing, aside from being retrospective, what's kind of the biggest limitation that you think is with the study, or one that maybe has become more apparent over time?
Oh, I think, firstly, I'd say my biggest limitation, there's always probably in any study, is your cohort numbers. So only 50 patients. And then when you break them up into 3 separate groups, they're all very small groups. So that's one thing we're really trying to address in our new study. There's obviously it's a retrospective study. It'd be great to be prospective, but I just find in trauma particularly, that is just so hard. And I've been part recently of some very big prospective randomized controlled trials here in Australia, and it's so hard to get patients to consent to go down the path of the randomized. They end up just saying, I want this, or what do you want to do, kind of thing. It's just, anyways, I find that very difficult. And really, basically, the other thing was probably just, as you said, was the outcome scores not being validated, but they're the best I think we've got at the moment. And we'll continue to use them. So they're probably the 3 major things, the limitations of our study, and that we're looking to try to address when we move forward with the next version of it.
All right. Well, I think that's it. And I really appreciate you taking the time. I know there's a big time difference, and we appreciate you being here with us. So thanks again.
Look forward to the questions and answers. Thanks very much, Kyle. Thanks for having me.